Practice Test 3, page 106, section 1. Summarize spoken text. You will hear a short lecture. Write a summary for a fellow student who was not present at the lecture. You should write 50 to 70 words. You will have 10 minutes to finish this task. Your response will be judged on the quality of your writing and on how well your response presents the key points presented in the lecture. Lecture A.
Professor, could you say a bit more about this psychogeography you mentioned earlier?
Well, I could give you a short history of the subject, though it's not a subject in the academic sense, as far as I'm aware, or at least not at the college where I teach.
But what is it exactly? It sounds rather complicated. A mixture of what? Psychology and geography?
No, not at all. Well, the first theorist of it was a Frenchman, Guy Debord, and basically, in his words, it's the study of the effects of the geographical environment on the emotions and behaviour of people. Put like that, of course, it doesn't sound like anything new. People have always been aware at some level of the effect of their surroundings on their emotions and way of life. And this includes not just buildings, but the landscape as a whole, the climate and so on. But it is mainly an urban thing. And these days, people who call themselves psychogeographers tend to be harsh critics of the way modern city planners develop urban space. Really, I suppose, it asks people to pay more attention to their environment, be critical of it, and to note not just the aspects we've already mentioned, but the atmosphere created by them as well. I could go on and tell you how to go about it, but all you have to do is go online and you'll find a site for almost any city you care to name. It's worth looking into.
Lecture B.
It is almost impossible to talk about the history of the novel without starting with a definition of it, which is by no means easy to do. We all know what we ourselves mean by a novel and have our favourite novelists, whether they are from the heyday of Victorian fiction, Dickens, say, or George Eliot, or someone more modern or postmodern. For example, B.S. Johnson, who is famed for writing a novel that was bought in a box with loose pages that you could read in any order. Again, you might be a fan of crime or detective fiction, which brings the added complication of genre. That is, does the fact that a work of fiction is comedy, tragedy, satire, ghost story, and so on, affect our definition? Anyway, as far as the history of the English novel is concerned, we're on fairly solid ground when we date the first novels to the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The first that is still read as a novel, in the way we read novels now, is Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which did have an enormous effect on English prose writing. But for me, it would be Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Now, people have tried to locate the beginnings even earlier than this, to Elizabethan prose writing, and even further back. But I think this is to lose sight of what a novel is and does, and confuses any kind of fiction with the true novel.
Lecture C.
It was the philosopher Thomas Nagel, I think, who came up with the thought experiment of trying to imagine what it's like to be a bat. Though I suppose any animal would do. The point is, of course, that you can't, just as you can't know what it's really like to be another person. I mean, know rather than imagine. How much can we know of what goes on in another person's mind? We observe people, watch what they do, listen to what they say, and other sounds they may make. see how they respond to their environment, their likes and dislikes, what they eat, and so on. And from this, we have learned to make fairly accurate predictions about how they'll behave in certain situations. Yet we still can't be sure what thoughts have passed through their minds, and certainly not what it feels like to them. We can guess, based on personal experience in similar situations, so we must assume that humans are alike enough for us to be reasonably certain that, for example, we experience the colour red in roughly the same way, or in the same ways. But again, to you, red might bring to mind thoughts of blood and death, whereas to someone else, warmth or excitement. And the differences can't just be cultural.
Practice Test 3, page 107, section 2. Multiple choice. Choose multiple answers. Listen to the recording and answer the question by selecting all the correct responses. You will need to select more than one response. Recording A.
There are two main reasons why parents decide to educate their children at home. Either they dislike schools on principle, however odd those principles might be, or they don't believe their local schools provide an adequate education or the right sort of education for their children. If someone decides to teach their child at home, either by themselves or by employing a teacher, they have to convince their local education authority, LEA, that the teaching provided is satisfactory. Schedules, lesson plans and book lists must be shown, and it must also be demonstrated that the child is in fact learning and that they have adequate opportunities for physical education and meeting other children. Furthermore, while there is no formal assessment, officers from the LEA will come and inspect what is being done and look at the child's exercise books. If they are not satisfied, they make out a school attendance order.
Recording B.
Certainly in Europe and the West, we tend to think of bread as the staple food in our diet, as many proverbs and sayings such as "bread is the staff of life" attest. Yet for the majority of the world's population, the most important staple food is not wheat, but rice, which is the seed of a different type of grass. The earliest evidence we have of rice being cultivated dates back to 8,000 years ago, when rice grains of that period were discovered in a village in China. By around 6,000 years ago, the cultivation of both long-grain and short-grain rice had become well established in China and had just got going in India. The word rice itself, however, is derived from the Aramaic urutza and came to us by way of Greek and Arabic. In fact, it was the Arabs who introduced rice to their Spanish territories in the 7th century, but it didn't spread to the rest of Europe until much later when, in the 15th century, Spaniards began to cultivate their own short-grain variety at Pisa in Italy.
Recording C.
The earliest writers on politics, and I'm thinking of Plato and Aristotle here, felt free to draw insights from all areas of human knowledge, unlike modern academic writers who tend to put things into smaller and smaller compartments or focus more closely on one area of inquiry. For example, Plato would examine a whole political system and the philosophy that underlies it, whereas modern writers on politics might concentrate on one particular institution in that system, the House of Lords in England, or on voting patterns within a country. With this focus, the bigger questions that the ancients dealt with what is the best form of government or what is justice, tend to get left behind. Many writers on politics these days are university-based and so have to have specialised interests. And while they may make new and interesting discoveries in their special field, it is at the loss of a broader perspective, not to mention the loss of a general audience or readership. In the 19th century, there were still writers who used the same freedom of inquiry as the ancients, and are all the more readable and relevant because of it.
Practice Test 3, page 108, section 2. Fill in the blanks. You will hear a recording. Write the missing words in each blank. Recording A.
There have been many studies in America of the opinions and behavior of university lecturers and professors, and of well-known free or public thinkers who are not attached to a university or other institution, which show that those who are recognized as being more successful or productive as scholars in their field, or are at the best universities, are much more likely to have critical opinions. That is to say, that they are more likely to hold liberal views, in the American use of that word, than those of their colleagues who are less creative or who have less of a reputation. The better a university is, as measured by the test results of its students or by the prestige of its staff, the more likely it has been that there will be student unrest and a relatively left-of-center faculty.
Recording B.
However simple or complex the chain of events in any given situation, when looked into, it usually reveals a train of causal relationships. They are seen to be linked in some way. The methods of analysis aim to establish these relationships and provide a solid background for useful generalizations based on what at first appear to be separate events. The first step in this process is to collect facts and then see if any particular patterns emerge. If they do, it then becomes possible to form theories related to the facts, and this type of empirical theory forms a useful basis for analysis and prediction. However, on its own, this theory is not enough. The essential second step is to test it by collecting more facts and by checking predictions against events. These new facts may mean you have to modify the theory, bearing in mind that new facts can only either disprove or support a theory. They cannot prove it to be right.
Recording C.
It is difficult to know how to place Montesquieu if you're the kind of person who likes to categorise. Historian, political philosopher, sociologist, jurist, or, if you think the Persian letters a novel, a novelist. He was all these things. Perhaps, as some have, he could be placed among that almost extinct species, the man of letters. The books that make up the spirit of the laws have had the most influence on later thinkers, and in them, as in his equally great Considerations on the Causes of the Grandeur and Decadence of the Romans, he makes his underlying purpose clear. It is to make the random, apparently meaningless variety of events understandable. He wanted to find out what the historical truth was. His starting point, then, was this almost endless variety of morals, customs, ideas, laws and institutions, and to make some sense out of them. He believed it was not chance that ruled the world, and that beyond the chaos of accidents, there must be underlying causes that account for the apparent madness of things.
Practice Test 3, page 110, section 2. Highlight correct summary. You will hear a recording. Choose the paragraph that best relates to the recording. Recording A.
How did I get into anthropology? Well, I'm not an anthropologist. Not trained in it anyway. In fact, I'm a marine biologist. And it's more that I'm interested in the strand lopers, the beach walkers, if you like, than in anthropology generally. In fact, it was through my early interest in all things to do with the sea that I first heard of them. As a kid, my favourite pastime was getting down to the beach and mucking about in rock pools and collecting anything the sea tossed up. And, the strand lopers lived off the sea and seashore, gathering food such as mussels, oysters, crabs and so on, just as I did. So when I heard of them, I thought, right, this is my kind of thing, and I felt a kind of, affinity for them. At first, people thought they were a myth, I suppose because there didn't seem to be much evidence for their existence. But now we do have archaeological evidence such as pottery, discarded shells, the bones of seals and large fish and so on. And those shells, we believe, became their first tools, and in some cases were also used as money and jewellery. Of course, before they had the implements, the tools to hunt and fish, everything had to be caught by hand, so they kept mostly to shallow water. Then they might have used a primitive form of fishing line, perhaps the tendril of a climbing plant or a strip of animal skin with a bone or small piece of wood that would stick in the fish's throat. Anyway, the more we search, the more we discover. Most recently, caves on the coast have been discovered with ancient drawings. I find it endlessly fascinating.
Recording B.
To reach some kind of understanding of a period in the past, the Middle Ages, say, requires a creative act of the imagination not unlike that of a novelist getting inside the skins of their characters or establishing the environment they live in. What must it have been like to be a peasant under a feudal baron? What might his beliefs and politics have been? Did he, for example, think his situation was simply part of the natural order of things, or that it was grossly unfair and needed to be overthrown? So you have to imagine the terms under which life was lived in those days, and learn to feel in a different way about things by putting yourself into a world very different from your own. Now, of course, every age views the past from its own present, and an 18th century historian's concept of the Middle Ages will be very different from that of one from the 21st century, which is why each age has to write its history over again. It's not so much that more facts or evidence come to light, if they do, but that sensibilities change too.
Practice Test 3, page 112, Section 2. Multiple choice. Choose single answer. Listen to the recording and answer the multiple choice question by selecting the correct response. Only one response is correct. Recording A.
Map making has a long and fascinating history. Both before Ptolemy produced the first great map of the world and after, up to the beautiful simplicity of the London Underground map and the precisely detailed Ordnance Survey maps, which cover almost every inch of the United Kingdom. Ancient mapmakers used to draw in hills, valleys and rivers to give an idea of the topography, the shape of the land. It wasn't until the late 16th century that contour lines were used, that is, lines that linked points of the land at the same height. But this was to show the relative depths and shallows of a river. The first time land contours were used was on a map of France, which took about 40 years to complete and was finished in 1783. The Ordnance Survey was set up in 1791, and their maps, as the name suggests, were originally made for military purposes, and the first one to be produced was of the county of Kent, at a ratio of 1 inch to 1 mile.
Recording B.
Signs advertising business premises have been around for thousands of years and were used in ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome to attract customers. And they often used symbols to illustrate what kind of business it was. For example, bushes or branches of ivy meant the place was a tavern. Both of these, the tavern and its sign, were introduced into Britain by the Romans in the first half of the 1st century AD. In Europe in the Middle Ages, signs became more common. Then, in the 14th century, English merchants were obliged to have them outside their shops. However, the fashion was to have large swinging signs hung from a strut sticking out of the wall, and many public houses still have such signs. But so many accidents occurred, mostly involving people on horseback, that in the 17th century a law was brought in, requiring shopkeepers to mount their signs flat against the wall of the premises, where they could do no harm.
Recording C.
The basic English person's diet in medieval times was made up of bread, cheese and beef, while ale was the drink for all ages and social classes except for the aristocracy who drank wine. In winter there were no root crops to feed the animals, so they were killed in autumn and the meat salted to preserve it. People kept livestock even in the towns. Cows were usually kept tied or tethered, but pigs were allowed to wander at will, feeding on the rubbish off the streets. By the 16th century, however, choice in foodstuffs had grown, including exotic spices to add flavour to the usual diet. This had come about because European rulers, wanting to increase their power and wealth, and also, in fairness, in the spirit of inquiry and the quest for knowledge, had financed voyages of exploration overseas. This opened up trade routes, bringing precious spices and vast profits from the east, and to the west, Spanish and Portuguese explorers had brought back such novelties as potatoes, tomatoes, maize, peppers, and chocolate. It must be said, though, that it took people some time to accept some of these new foods, as they feared they were poisonous.
Practice Test 3, page 113, section 2. Select missing word. You will hear a recording about climate change. At the end of the recording, the last word or group of words has been replaced by a beep. Select the correct option to complete the recording. Recording A.
How much the Earth's climate will change in the future depends, among other things, on how quickly and to what extent the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere increases. If we take no action to limit future greenhouse gas emissions, it is estimated that there will be a rise in temperature of 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius every 10 years. This is a far greater rate of warming than anything that has occurred over the past 10,000 years. One set of predictions claims that some regions of the world will warm more quickly than others, and rainfall will also increase in some areas and decrease in others. These changes will affect the sea level, which could rise by 50 centimetres over the next century. All this will affect humans through the effects it has on water resources.
you will hear a recording about parental discipline. At the end of the recording, the last word or group of words has been replaced by a beep. Select the correct option to complete the recording. Recording B.
When parents are asked how they handle their very unruly children, most will admit that they are likely to use physical forms of punishment. This is not to say that a parent generally hits their child each and every time they are bad. Nevertheless, parents generally use physical punishment as a last resort, after having unsuccessfully tried other forms of discipline with children who have become very bad. Those who believe in physical punishment, however, are unaware of the fact that it does not lead to better children. In fact, the opposite is true. Research findings show that children from homes where corporal punishment is the norm exhibit more antisocial behaviour than children whose parents seldom or never hit them. For example, children whose parents systematically use corporal punishment are more often than not behind any classroom disruptions. Such children not only create discipline problems at school, but they are also overly aggressive. In addition, they have extremely low self-esteem and a negative attitude to those around them. On the other hand, children whose parents use less harsh methods of discipline have a healthier attitude towards their school environment and
Practice Test 3, page 114, section 2. Highlight incorrect words. You will hear a recording. Below is a transcription of the recording. Some words in the transcription differ from what the speaker said. As you listen, circle the words that are different. Recording A.
no news is good news. May be true for most of us most of the time. After all, we don't look forward to unpleasant things happening to us. But bad news is good news is true for those who work in the news media, and I suspect for the rest of us at least some of the time. It is tied up with stories and our seemingly insatiable need for stories. Have you ever been gripped by a story where nothing goes wrong for the characters? There's an incident in a Kingsley Amis novel that nicely illustrates this. The main character, Jake, comes home to find his wife chatting to a friend about a hairdresser both women know, who has moved with his family to somewhere in Africa. Jake listens in, expecting tales of cannibalism and such like. But no. The friend has just received a letter saying they love the place and are settling in nicely. Jake leaves the room in disgust. We demand to be entertained, and while we don't object to a happy ending, the characters have to have experienced loss, pain and hardship in one form or another along the way to have deserved it.
Recording B.
Leisure travel was, in a sense, a British invention. This was mainly due to economic and social factors. Britain was the first country to become fully industrialised, and industrial society offered growing numbers of people time for leisure. This, coupled with improvements in transport, especially the railways, meant that large numbers of people could get to holiday resorts in a very short time. Modern mass tourism, of a sort we can easily recognise today, began in 1841, when Thomas Cook organised the first package tour, in which everything was included in the cost: travel, hotel and entertainment. To cater for the large numbers of new holidaymakers, holiday camps were established, both on the coast and in the countryside, and they became immensely popular. Their popularity declined, however, with the rise of cheap overseas tours, which gave many people their first opportunity to travel abroad.
Practice Test 3, page 114, Section 2. Write from dictation. You will hear some sentences. Write each sentence exactly as you hear it. Write as much of each sentence as you can. You will hear each sentence only once.
This has been a major source of confusion for academics.
None of the alternatives is satisfactory.
The aim of the course is to provide a broad theoretical basis.
Has all the evidence been properly examined?